Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. Really excited to be talking to you here tonight at the Groton Public Library. I really relish the chance to get this information out to the public. So my name is Ben Rayner. I run an organization called Water Emergency Training, WET, and it's dedicated solely to drowning prevention. Just a little bit on my background so you know who it is who's talking to you. For many years, I worked for a company called Survival Systems here in Groton, Connecticut. And what they taught was a skill called underwater egress, which is a fancy term for how to get out of things underwater. And the main focus there was to teach folks how to get out of aircraft that have crashed into water, fixed wing aircraft and helicopters. This was mostly military law enforcement, also flight doctors, flight nurses. I learned a lot there. I'm very proud to have worked there. We kind of call it, we help save the lives of the people who save lives. And we trained again across the whole spectrum of the aviation industry, from the folks who took down bin Laden, all the way up to David Lee Roth from Van Halen and everybody in between. One of the strange facts that I learned while working there is most people actually survive these ditching or crashes into water. And unfortunately, they end up losing their lives by drowning after the fact. And as I worked there, I also had a strong background as a writer. I worked as a reporter for a small paper along the shoreline and also for the New London Day. And I used to do a lot of research and articles for Sailing Magazine and Aviation Trade magazines. And I began contacts with a lot of the safety experts in the field, pilots and mariners and hypothermia experts and water safety experts. And I really became passionate about it. And I really wanted to bring everything I was learning out to the general public. And the more I learned about it, the more I learned how much I didn't know. And I realized if I didn't know it, as someone who was in the industry, the general public really wasn't going to know it either. And so I'm really passionate about getting this information out to the public and really just informing people of how dangerous the water can be. So a couple of facts just to let you know exactly how dangerous it can be. And just so we're clear, I love the water. I'm passionate about it. I surf and fish and swim. And actually, I'm not sure if what I do is actually surfing these days. It's more flopping around in the water. But I am in the water with a board. So I don't want to discourage anybody from enjoying the water. But there are some things that you need to know if you're in or on the water, regardless of what you're doing. Boating, swimming, whether you're in a pool, whether you're 40 miles offshore trying to catch tuna. There's just some basic things that are important to know. So some of the stats. In the United States in the average year, the leading cause of accidental death for children 14 years of age and younger is drowning. Believe it or not, a child is 10 times more likely to drown than to be shot accidentally with a gun, which is a pretty sobering stat, and that's not making light of any tragedy. But that's a lot of folks who die. In fact, more Americans die every year from drowning than die from distracted driving. And we all know we shouldn't text and drive, we shouldn't be on our phone, we shouldn't be looking at Facebook. And that's in our consciousness, whether we obey those laws or not. We all are aware of that, or at least most of us are, but I don't think most people are aware of that statistic of how many folks actually perish in the water. And there's a number of reasons for that, both for children and adults, and those are some of the things that I want to touch on tonight. And just talk to you about some incidents that I've gone through in my research, and just to enlighten you and make you understand nobody is immune from this. The people who drowned, they are oftentimes folks who can't swim with no experience, but a huge percentage of people who drowned are people who've been in and on the water for decades, who know how to swim and consider themselves water experts, or at least water experienced, before these tragedies struck them or their loved ones. So when it comes to drowning, a lot of us have some misconceptions. that they're splashing and people are going to cry for help, and that simply doesn't happen. Drowning is actually, and this is kind of counterintuitive, it's relatively silent. I've seen some real horrific videos of folks who've drowned, some who did perish, some who were saved, and it's very silent. People don't splash at the surface, they don't scream for help, especially children. Children, when they get into trouble in the water, panic very, very quickly. And these tragedies can happen literally in a matter of seconds. There was a case a number of years ago, actually it was 2011 up in Massachusetts at a public pool where it made national headlines because this woman drowned, and unfortunately her body wasn't discovered for a number of days, and that's why this tragedy made the news. But what didn't make the news was there was actually a film of it. And she came down a water slide, hit the water, came up briefly, and then went under the water and drowned. And there was probably 6 to 10, maybe more people within a 10-foot radius of her, and nobody saw it. Nobody saw it. She drowned in front of everybody, and these tragedies happen all the time. And when it comes to children, the number one cause of these drownings is supervisory inattention. We simply don't pay attention as parents or guardians, aunts, uncles, whoever we are. And so you really need to think about that when your kids are around the water. You must be vigilant. In this day and age of electronic devices, you cannot be on your phone or go inside to shoot off an email or get a couple of work things done, because these drowning incidents happen so quickly. There is no mommy, help us. If you're relying on other kids who are playing with your child as you go inside to use the restroom or to fix another cocktail or to send a few emails, that's not going to happen, because these kids aren't going to know it either. If an adult doesn't recognize a child drowning, these children aren't going to recognize it either. And again, these incidents happen so quickly. So if you're in charge of watching the kids, you really got to do it. Certainly, within reason. You don't have to be, chained to the side of the pool and watch the kids, but you can't get distracted with electronic devices or going out to leave. There was a horrible story from the early 1990s in California where a young babysitter, she was 13 years old, she had a gastrointestinal episode and had to run to the bathroom, and 2 kids, 2 and 4, got into the pool and both of them drowned in the time it took her to go to the bathroom and come out. And that's certainly not a 13-year-old's fault, but that's how quickly it happens. One of the more well-known cases, folks down this end of the state may not recognize the name, but Stu Leonard's is a pretty well-known grocery chain towards the New York section of Connecticut, or the New York side of Connecticut. His 22-month-old son drowned, and it was the classic case of, I thought you were watching. No, I thought you were watching. And those type of things with parents happen all the time. It's a Facebook moment if your kid dumps a bowl of macaroni on their head because you're not watching them, but it's a life-altering tragedy if a drowning occurs. So you got to be vigilant around kids. They're fascinated with water. They want to get into it. And if you're in charge, you really got to think about how you're going to not only watch these folks, but deal with some sort of emergency. So some of the things to think about, you have a pool, a beach house, wherever it is. Can your 71-year-old mother-in-law dive down to the bottom of the deep end of the pool and pull your 10-year-old off the bottom of the pool, get them up on the deck, call 911, and begin to initiate life-saving procedures? I mean, can you do that? It's a lot harder than it looks to pull even a small child, especially out of an above-ground pool. If you've got an in-ground pool, it's a little easier because it's graduated and you can pull people up and out. But when you think about an above-ground pool, there really is no shallow end. And that doesn't look like a far distance to pull somebody up and out, but it is. It can be very difficult to move people around. I've had a lot of experience with people in the water, and that dead weight can be very, very difficult to maneuver around. So is the person, your mother-in-law, the 14-year-old babysitter who's watching your 9-year-old, is she going to be capable of diving down to the bottom of the pool and pulling your child or the next door neighbor's kid off of the bottom of the pool and begin to initiate some sort of life-saving skills? So think about those things. If you're around water, if you're watching kids around water, especially if you're charging somebody else to watch children around water, really want to be vigilant and just understand those dangers. When it comes to us adults, the factors that go into drownings for adults, and unfortunately we had a real tragedy here in Groton not too far away just a month or two ago, where several gentlemen drowned right off of Bluff Point. And that was as a result of one of the main factors, which is water temperature. When you go into water temperatures that are below about 65 degrees, there's a little bit of debate in the science community as to where this phenomenon occurs, but about 65 degrees or cooler is considered cold water. There's a phenomenon that happens called the cold water shock response or the cold water gasp reflex. And most of us here have probably felt that before. You jump into a pool, even a cold shower, and you get that. That's not because you're a wimp. That's actually an involuntary human response to cold water. We gasp uncontrollably. And if you think about it, the very last thing that you want to be doing, involuntarily or otherwise, is gasping as your airway is going up and down in the water. And unfortunately, this phenomenon is a huge factor in a lot of drownings. If you go into water below 60 degrees, your survival time is not measured in hours or even minutes. It's usually measured in seconds. Most people are drowning and under the water in 30 seconds to a minute. That's how quickly it can happen. And again, there's very little shouting. When you're struggling and gasping for breath, it's really, really difficult to scream for help at the same time, if not impossible. And many of the drownings, especially in our state, are really attributed to this cold water gasp reflex or cold water shock response. There's a lot of science involved in it. I don't want to get too into the weeds on that. But it's something that you really need to think about if you're any type of water activity. If you're going kayaking, even as something as simple as working on your boat down at the boatyard in March or in November, you're bringing your boat in or out of the water. Unfortunately, folks drown at marinas all the time. They fall off their boats and they have not put any thought into how am I going to get out of here. A lot of marinas are installing safety ladders now, but that's one of the things that you should make sure you understand about your marina. Does your marina have a safety ladder? Do you know where it is? You know, just a simple thing of if you're working on your boat going, okay, if I fall in, where do I want to swim to? That simple question might save your life. That ladder might be very close to where you are, but not visible when you're in the water, especially if you're panicked and struggling. So cold water, very, very deadly. And certainly if you can survive that first minute, you're literally not out of the water yet. Hypothermia can kick in, and unfortunately people perish from that. But really understanding how that cold water affects you is vital. So it's imperative that you always wear a life vest whenever you're around the water. I know from personal experience, I've gone through the cold water gasp reflex a number of times, and the only way to really get around it is very slow, deep breathing. Again, easy to say up here standing in front of a crowd of folks, much more difficult when you're panicked in the water, because once it happens, you begin breathing harder and harder and harder. You begin to hyperventilate. You're not getting properly oxygenated. Things stop working, and all of these things compound together to cause drownings very, very quickly. So nice, slow, steady breathing, calm yourself down. I know once years ago, before I even learned all of this stuff, I lived in Chicago. I used to surf all over the Great Lakes, and one day I was lost my board. I was in gigantic waves, 20, 25-foot waves, about I don't think it was a half mile from shore, but it was over a quarter mile from shore, and the realization comes to you very quickly, like, I'm in a lot of trouble. I don't have a surfboard, and I got a long swim ahead of me. And I literally was talking to myself out loud going, everybody calm down, everybody calm down. Let's get our stuff together here and focus on what we have to do. So that can be very beneficial of just getting yourself in a place, getting that breathing under control and getting that panic under control. And it's a lot easier to do if you have a life vest on. So anytime you're in or on the water, really vital to have a life vest. Again, I hesitate to comment on drowning incidents where I don't have all the info, but a lot of these incidents where people drowned are the results of folks who don't have a life vest. I know a year ago, February, there was a kayaker who drowned up in Norwich who did not have a life vest. And many of these incidents have it. Why people don't wear life vests when they go out boating, I've never been able to figure it out. It's really such a simple thing to do. And one of the things I like to tell folks is wear a life vest. Even if it's not for you, if you have a life vest on, you can take it and throw it off and give it to someone else who's fallen in the water. It also gives you the ability to be a rescuer. If somebody's in trouble and you're on the water and you have a vest, much easier to help rescue someone if you've got a life vest on than trying to go out there and possibly compounding that water emergency with a panicked person who's trying to grab you. You can swim out there safely with a vest, take it off and push that vest to them. Any number of ways to manipulate that to make it a safe resolution. So remember, always wear that vest. Personal story I had is I was fishing with my friends. This probably goes back 4 or 5 years. We were right off of Groton Long Point, a couple hundred yards, and this woman, senior citizen, she was obviously in her 60s at a minimum, was in a kayak a couple hundred yards off Groton Long Point with no life vest. And you just have to shake your head at something like that. If I don't care how strong a swimmer that person is, if she had somehow gotten into the water, got hit by a boat wake, the boat tips over, whatever it is, that's just a tragedy waiting to happen. So always have a vest on any type of water activity you're doing. Even in the backyard pool for small kids, get them to have a vest on. Start them early with that consciousness of taking that water safety seriously. Just plant that seed in their head. So a couple other things to think about as far as pool safety. There are a lot of laws as far as your fencing. Most of it's fairly standard. There are some states that don't require it, but most states do. One of the things to think about, though, is that when folks have their pools fenced, we tend to have this idea in our head that we have this fence to keep the neighbors' kids out, to keep the dogs in the neighborhood out of our pool. But statistically, the folks who are going to drown are the people who live in the home. And so if your house is actually part of the fencing unit, if this is your house and your fence runs around your house, there's kind of an inherent flaw in that safety design. So if there's a way for your home pool to have it fenced off where your house is not actually part of the barrier, that is really what's making a pool safe. Quite honestly, I understand it's not practical for some folks to do that. You can put up temporary fencing, but that's probably a major cost. A lot of folks may not want to do that. So if you've got your home as part of that barrier, it's even more imperative that you are attentive to anybody who's in your pool or on your pool deck, even if they're not swimming. There's some other things, surface disruption alarms. They've come onto the market in the last couple of decades or last 10, 15 years. You put those in your pool, something causes a disruption and they'll go off. Also cameras, pool cameras are great, but we don't want to get complacent. You can't have an alarm or a camera take over for you, because people drowned in pools that have cameras on them. Again, I've seen the videos of it. And people drown in pools where there's surface disruption alarms. You know, if you've got an alarm that goes off all the time, it's just like a car alarm that goes off all the time. It just becomes annoying rather than being any type of safety value. Also, when it comes to covers and nets, pool covers are kind of designed for thermal protection or to protect, to keep out, debris from getting in your pool. Then there's actual pool nets that keep people from, actually falling into the pool. Those ones are usually a little more rigid in their structure, but understand the difference between those. Pool nets prevent drownings. Pool covers don't. They're not designed for that. They can actually compound a drowning. If you fall into a pool with a pool cover, you can become tangled up in that. And unfortunately, there's incidents of these things happening. In fact, I know of a few incidents that have occurred of where folks delivering fuel oil or other energy products get that hose on their shoulder and walk across a backyard to fill a pool and didn't realize that there's a pool there because there's 6 inches of snow on top of it, and end up falling into a pool. So think about those things. To be really safe, you want to have a pool net on your pool to make sure that you can actually prevent people from actually falling into the water, and just understand the difference on that. Also, one of the other big factor that comes in, remember temperature when it comes to water, and also the movement. Any type of movement is going to compound the inherent hazard of water. Around here, it's real easy. We got tides, currents, and they can be very deceiving. I've spent a lot of time in the water out here on this part of Long Island Sound, and it's just really tricky. Most people who don't boat probably aren't aware that the entrance to Long Island Sound, whether you're coming through Watch Hill or the Race, is actually on the bucket list of a lot of world sailors, because the conditions in Long Island Sound make it really challenging. You really have to be a good boater to get into Long Island Sound and navigate your way down to New York City. It can be very, very tricky in there. You would think that if the tide was coming in, it's going to bring everything with it into land, and that isn't necessarily so. Depending on the bottom, the contours, you can get carried out to sea on an incoming tide, or carried away from land on an incoming tide. It can swirl around. It does all sorts of weird and screwy things. I mean, I've seen currents out there. There's literally a river in the ocean that's coming by, and you've got 3 different directions in a 40 or 50 yard square area of where the water is moving. You can see that from a boat, but when you're in the water and your head's like this, very difficult to tell. If water is moving, even a very slight movement of a half a knot is going to cancel out any effort. I won't get too much into sea survival. I was a sea survival instructor for a long time, and and this is my own personal belief. There are other people who don't necessarily agree with this, and there are plenty of cases of people who've made epic swims to save their lives, but that's really rare. If you're in the water and it's moving, just go with the flow. Don't try to fight against it. You are not going to beat it. Again, even a very small opposing current is going to cancel out any type of effort that you make as a swimmer. And again, for tonight's purposes, we're not going to go too deep into that. You can read it in the book or on the website about when to swim for it. There are some loose criteria about what you want to think about. But again, that people who swim for it usually don't make it. And again, you can find exceptions to the rules. There was a pro baseball player a few years ago in Florida who fell off his boat. They estimated he swam 22 or 24 miles for safety. But that's really truly the exception. There are a lot of folks, in fact, famous story of Eddie Aikau. He is considered to have invented modern lifeguarding. He's credited with saving more people in the water than any other person. A great surfer, and he died trying to swim for it. He's with some folks whose boat overturned off the coast of Maui, and he tried to make a 12-mile swim on his surfboard, and he was never seen again. So that was with a surfboard as well. The last thing he did before he left the group of people was to take off his life vest. So think about things like that when you're in the water. Simply being aware of your surroundings and aware of the tides and currents, because that water movement, river movement, hugely dangerous. Again, there was a tragedy up in Brantford last summer. 10-year-old boy drowned when he fell into a sluiceway. Basically, it was a drainage pipe. I know the area well. I grew up there. I used to play around there as a kid. He was with his brothers. He fell in. He got sucked into this pipe, and he drowned before he could get shot out the other side. Really tragic. Make sure kids know any type of water movement. You really want to stay away from moving water if at all possible. Rip currents. Again, I myself, I was caught in a rip current last year surfing, and really got into in trouble just really quickly. You know, I'm a water safety expert. It was a cold day. I was exhausted. I should have been out of the water, but I just wanted to get a couple more waves. I was body surfing and got myself a cramp, and in a matter of seconds, I was washed up into the rocks and was very fortunate to get out of there without any injuries or drowning. It can happen to anybody, anytime. In fact, the water safety organizations estimate that 80% of beach rescues made by lifeguards are due to rip currents. So rip currents is really a subject that's I could talk for an hour about. There's a lot of research on that, but when it comes to rip currents, any type of wave action can cause a rip current. You can get a rip current on a fairly gentle day, and again, that opposing current is what kills people. They panic and try to swim against it. They exhaust their energy in a matter of seconds, and they simply can't survive and drown. It goes against the voice in your head, but if you're caught in a rip current, just enjoy the ride and go out. Once you're out of it, you can swim right or left out of it and then make your way back to shore. Again, that's easy to talk about up here. It's a little different when you're in it. And then something like in my case where there's a jetty that's you're getting washed into, you don't have that option. So don't go in the water when there's waves unless you've got some experience. Ask a lifeguard. If there is no lifeguard, that should give you a clue that you shouldn't be in there. Ask somebody, ask a local or someone else on the beach. Again, I could talk for a long time about rip currents, but in general, moving water, very dangerous. You really want to think about any type of moving water, be it a river, currents, tides. They add a huge dimension, and when you compound that with a low temperature, you're really in a very dangerous place. And again, this happens quite frequently down this end of the state because we have a lot of rivers, we've got a lot of moving water, and it's generally cold for most of the year. So just a couple last things, and I'll wrap it up. I wanted to touch on boating a little bit. This isn't a boating class, but in general, a couple of things to think about when you're on a boat. If you own a boat, does your partner know how to start that boat? Does your husband or wife know how to start the boat? Does your 14-year-old son, your 12-year-old daughter know how to make a mayday call? These are some of the things that you want to think about if you're going to take folks out on the water. You really need to have somebody else on that boat who can perform basic boating maneuvers. Starting the boat, maneuvering it. Also, folks on the boat, making sure that there's at least two people on the boat who can make a mayday call, and if you can't, show somebody how to do it. Also, just in general, knowing where you're at. Again, I was talking with Ann Campbell earlier tonight about an incident that occurred last year here out in the race, where a gentleman went overboard and got carried away by a current, and his wife did not know where they were. She certainly knew that they were in Long Island Sound and knew that they were by the race, but that's not enough information for rescuers to come and help you. I know this is about 15 years ago in Guilford. I was fishing down at the Guilford Marina. A bunch of ambulances came racing into the parking lot. I knew some of the guys. I'm like, hey, what's going on? They're like, a couple guys' boat overturned, but they're on cell phones, and you know, we're going out there. We're going to be able to get them. We're just waiting for them to bring them in. And both of these guys were on the overturned boat, hanging onto the side. They both had working cell phones, and they both drowned. And they drowned because they could not tell the Coast Guard where they were. It seems like a simple thing. You know, Long Island Sound is so tiny. We can see Long Island from here. I mean, how hard it could be, but it's really a different story and a much more difficult task when it's reality. They were near Faulkner's Island, which is right off of Guilford. And again, it seems like a no-brainer. Where I can see Faulkner's Island, we're off Faulkner's Island, but unfortunately the Coast Guard simply could not get there in time to rescue these guys, and they both drowned. So a little bit of basic knowledge. Certainly we're not, you know, Magellan or something like that, and we're not gonna, you know, I don't understand GPS or plot coordinates myself, but certainly just knowing where you're at, making sure people who are on your boat know where you're at, that they know somebody else on the boat knows some just basic rudimentary seamanship, that they can make a mayday call on the radio and alert folks. Again, sometimes cell phones aren't going to work out in the middle of Long Island Sound, so you really need that radio. And then one last thing is your fire extinguisher on board. Make sure folks know how to use it. The acronym for fire extinguishers is PASS: pull, aim, squeeze, and sweep. Pull the pin, aim it at the fire, squeeze the handle, and sweep it. It's a little easier said than done. And one of the things that I personally recommend, and this is my own personal recommendation, that your home fire extinguisher and your boat fire extinguisher, camper fire extinguisher, every 2 years, just exhaust them. Put out a campfire, take them out in your backyard, call your local fire department and ask them where a spot that you could use it is, and let your kids do it, let your wife do it, let your husband spray it, and get a feel for what it's like to actually use a fire extinguisher. Then take it to a local place. You can have them recharge it. That way you know you've always got a recharge fire extinguisher, and folks around you have a little bit of experience with it. I mean, not only could you save a life, but you could save a boat. You know, boats aren't cheap. And if your 12-year-old daughter knows how to use a fire extinguisher when there's been an incident and you're unconscious and she can put that fire out, that's not only going to save a life, but again, could save a boat. Because when a car catches on fire, we can pull off to the side of the road and take a few steps back and film it on our phone. Your boat catches on fire, it's a whole different story. You're in the water next, and that's going to lead to a lot of different issues. So again, just to wrap up, remember, inattention is the biggest factor that comes in to play when we're talking about children who drowned. That water temperature and water movement are the things that are really going to compound any type of water tragedy. So I'd like to thank Groton Library and Ann Campbell as well for letting me speak here tonight, and I really appreciate it. Stay safe out there.